A thrilling story of redemption, love, passion, and new beginnings. They lived a forbidden love in their youth, until fate cruelly tore them apart. Decades later, he, now a cold millionaire, finds her washing dishes in a rundown hotel. But she harbors a devastating secret. Watch this story until the end. You'll be surprised by how it unfolds. If you enjoy love stories and romance, follow this channel. Leave your comment. We post videos like this every day. Continuing, the hot water vapor rose in dense clouds from the industrial sink, enveloping Helen Morris in a mist that seemed to protect her from the outside world. Her hands, calloused from years of hard work, moved with mechanical precision among the dirty dishes that accumulated in endless piles. The constant noise of the resort kitchen, the clinking of silverware, the hissing of pots, the hurried voices of the cooks, created a chaotic symphony that she had learned to use as a shield against her own thoughts. At 47, Helen had become a master in the art of being invisible. Her brown hair, prematurely grey at the temples, always remained tied in a functional bun that dispensed with any vanity. The navy blue uniform of the resort hung loosely on her thin body, as if she had shrunk into herself over the years. But it was her eyes that betrayed the inner storm. Deep brown eyes that carried invisible scars, a wounded gleam that she tried to hide beneath perpetually lowered eyelids. The Golden Coast Resort had seen better days. Located on a preserved stretch of the Florida coastline between St. Augustine and Daytona Beach, the complex had once been the favorite destination of the Jacksonville elite in the 90s. Now, 3 decades later, the buildings showed obvious signs of decay. Peeling paint on the exterior walls, pools with cracked tiles, gardens struggling against the weeds that insisted on sprouting between the stones of the pathways. The guests who still frequented the place were mainly middle-class tourists looking for promotional rates, executives on business trips with limited budgets, and families seeking the nostalgic charm of a time they had never lived. Helen lived in a small cottage at the back of the property, a simple 2-room construction that the previous owner had given to long-term employees. It was there that she took refuge after double shifts, when her legs ached and her hands burned from constant contact with chemical products. The cottage was strategically isolated, hidden by a row of royal palms that created a natural barrier between her small dwelling and the movement of the resort. It was exactly how she liked it, away from curious glances, casual comments, questions that could lead to places she was not willing to revisit. In the resort records, she appeared only as Helen M., a deliberate decision she had made on her first day of work, 5 years ago, when the manager asked how she would like to be identified on her badge. Morris was a surname that carried too much weight, memories that she had sworn to bury. Anonymity protected her, allowed her to exist in a state of emotional limbo where the past could not reach her. But on that Tuesday morning, as the golden autumn light filtered through the steamy kitchen windows, something in the air felt different. Helen sensed a strange restlessness, like an animal sensing a storm even before clouds formed on the horizon. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrubbed a white serving dish, and she had to stop for a moment to breathe deeply and calm her heartbeat. On the other side of the country, exactly 1,200 miles from that noisy kitchen, Richard Blackwell was signing documents in a meeting room on the 42nd floor of a commercial building in New York. The panoramic view of the city stretched before him, a sea of concrete and steel that reflected his own nature, imposing, cold, and impenetrable. At 50, Richard had built a hotel empire that extended across 15 countries, but success had exacted a price that he rarely admitted, even to himself. His dark hair, now cut with military precision and sprinkled with silver strands at the full sides, framed an angular face that seemed carved in marble. The grey-blue eyes, which had once been capable of conveying infinite tenderness, had become sharp blades capable of cutting down adversaries in business meetings. The impeccably tailored Italian suit could not completely hide the tension that inhabited his shoulders, nor the way his fingers constantly drummed on the table, a nervous tic he had developed in recent years. His secretary entered the room, carrying a red folder marked urgent, interrupting his thoughts. It was Martha, an efficient, middle-aged woman who had worked for him for more than a decade and knew his idiosyncrasies better than any living person. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, placing the folder on the table with calculated care. "The internal audit report for the Golden Coast Resort has arrived. The numbers are concerning." Richard raised his eyes from the contracts he was reviewing, a deep crease forming between his eyebrows. The Golden Coast was one of the smaller properties in his portfolio, an investment he had made years ago more out of nostalgic impulse than business strategy. The region brought him memories that he preferred not to examine too closely. "What kind of irregularities?" he asked, opening the folder and quickly flipping through pages dense with numbers and graphs. "Misappropriation of resources, supplier. Overcharging, possible money laundering through ghost accounts," Martha enumerated with her characteristic efficiency. "Enough to require an in-person investigation. The board recommends that you go personally. Your presence tends to accelerate confessions." Richard let out a sigh that carried decades of weariness. Business trips to problematic units were part of the routine, but there was something about the name of that place that made his stomach contract uncomfortably. Golden Coast, Florida coastline, territory he had avoided for reasons he refused to analyze. "Schedule it for Thursday," he finally said, closing the folder with a sharp movement. "There and back the same day. I don't want to stay overnight." Martha made notes in her electronic calendar, but hesitated before leaving the room. "Sir, may I make an observation?" Richard stared at her with an expression that discouraged intimacies, but she knew that look and wasn't intimidated. "You've avoided the region for years. Perhaps it's time to face whatever you've been avoiding. Ghosts don't resolve themselves." The door closed behind her before Richard could formulate an adequate response. He remained motionless for long minutes, staring at the city view while memories he had locked away tried to force their way into his consciousness. Helen. The name emerged in his mind like a blade, cutting through the layers of protection he had built over the years. He abruptly stood up, heading to the discreet bar installed in a corner of the room. The 20-year-old Scotch whiskey slid down his throat like liquid fire, but it wasn't enough to burn away the images that were beginning to form. Delicate hands intertwined with his, soft lips whispering promises in the dimness of forbidden corridors, brown eyes shining with love and hope in a time when the world still seemed full of possibilities. Thursday arrived wrapped in a thick mist that made the morning on the Florida coast even more melancholic. Helen arrived at work an hour earlier than usual, unable to remain in her cottage where nightmares had tormented her all night. Fragmented dreams where shadowy figures chased her through endless corridors, where distorted voices repeated unfulfilled promises, and where she ran toward a train that never reached the station. The resort kitchen was silent at that hour, only the hum of refrigerators and the dripping of a poorly closed faucet breaking the silence. Helen turned on the fluorescent lights that flickered a few times before stabilizing, bathing the environment in raw white light. She began her preparations for the workday with the ritualized movements of someone who transforms simple tasks into meditation. She organized the detergents in order of use, checked the water temperature, adjusted the height of the counter to avoid back pain. It was mid-morning when Roger, the general manager of the resort, appeared in the kitchen with an expression of poorly disguised nervousness. He was a corpulent man in his 60s, grey hair always disheveled, and a tendency to sweat excessively when under pressure, which happened with considerable frequency. "Helen," he called, approaching the sink where she worked, "today will be a different day. We're receiving a very important visitor, the owner of the chain himself, Richard Blackwell. I want everything impeccable, understand? Not a poorly washed dish, not a stain on the surfaces." The name hit Helen like a punch to the stomach. Her fingers contracted around the sponge she was holding, and for a moment she feared her legs would give way under the sudden weight that descended upon her shoulders. Richard. Here. After all these years, all the places she had fled to, all the false names and discarded identities, fate conspired to bring him exactly to her. "Helen, are you all right?" Roger's voice sounded distant, as if reaching her through a long, dark tunnel. She forced herself to breathe, concentrating on the sensation of warm water flowing between her fingers, anchoring herself in the present to avoid getting lost in a past that was suddenly gaining too sharp contours. "I'm fine," she managed to say, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "Don't worry, everything will be perfect." Roger studied her for another moment, noting the sudden paleness. That had taken over her face, but didn't ask more questions. He had too many problems to worry about the personal dramas of employees. The following hours passed in a blur of frantic movement. Helen lost herself in the routine, washing, rinsing, drying, organizing, in a mechanical dance that prevented her from thinking. But no matter how hard she tried to focus only on the work, her mind kept returning to that name, Richard Blackwell, the man she had loved with every fiber of her being, the man who had promised a new life and then disappeared like smoke. The man who never knew he had a son. It was around 2 in the afternoon when she heard male voices approaching the kitchen area. One of them made her blood freeze in her veins, deep, measured, carrying a natural authority that she knew all too well. For 30 years she had tried to forget that voice, but discovered that time had not weakened her ability to recognize it instantly. Helen turned her back to the kitchen entrance, leaning over the sink as if completely absorbed in her work. Her hair, loose in the morning, was now tied in an even tighter bun, creating an additional barrier between her and the outside world. She silently prayed that he would pass straight through, that he wouldn't look in her direction, that fate would grant her a few more years of anonymity. But fate, she knew well, was rarely merciful. Richard entered the kitchen, followed by Roger, and 2 men in suits whom she presumed to be lawyers or auditors. He had grown since the last time she saw him, not in height, but in presence. He occupied space differently, like someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The dark, impeccably tailored suit, the Italian shoes that shone even under the fluorescent kitchen light, the erect posture that demonstrated decades of confidence, everything about him screamed success and power. But it was his eyes that haunted her. Still the same grey-blue eyes that had once looked at her, as if she were the only woman in the world. Now, however, they carried a coldness she didn't recognize, a hardness that spoke of years of battles won and losses that left invisible scars. "The kitchen area is where we detected most of the irregularities," Roger was saying, gesturing nervously as he guided the group. "Supplier overcharging, inferior quality products being purchased at premium ingredient prices." Richard walked slowly through the space, examining every detail with eagle eyes. His hands, she noticed, were thicker than she remembered, the hands of a man who had worked hard to build an empire. A gold wedding band shone on his ring finger, and Helen felt a sharp pang in her chest when she realized he had married. Of course he had married. 30 years was enough time for an entire life of events. He was approaching the area where she worked, and Helen could feel his presence like a physical pressure in the air around her. Her heart was beating so hard that she feared the sound would be audible throughout the kitchen. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, to hide, to not face that moment she had spent decades fearing and secretly longing for. "And here we have our hygiene area," Roger continued, approaching the sink where Helen worked. "Our most dedicated employee, Helen. She's been with us for 5 years, always exemplary." That's when it happened. Richard, who until that moment had maintained a professional and distant expression, looked in the direction Roger indicated. His eyes found Helen's profile, and the world simply stopped. Time fragmented. For a moment that seemed eternal, Richard remained completely still, as if he had turned into a pillar of salt. His breath caught in his throat, his eyes widened in an expression of pure uncontrollable shock. The folder he was carrying in his hands slipped, scattering papers across the kitchen floor with a noise that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Helen turned slowly, as if moving through molasses. When her eyes finally met his, the impact was like a head-on collision between 2 high-speed trains. Everything they had built to protect themselves from pain, the emotional barriers, the years of unofficial therapy through hard work, the carefully fabricated identities, crumbled in an instant. "Helen," he whispered, and her name on his lips sounded like both a prayer and a curse. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The words had died in her throat, replaced by a knot of emotions, so complex that her brain refused to process them. Love, hate, longing, hurt, desire, fear, all mixed in a storm that threatened to destroy her. Roger looked from one to the other with growing confusion, perceiving that something important was happening, but unable to decipher exactly what. The other men remained in awkward silence, unwilling witnesses to a moment that clearly transcended professional matters. "You know each other?" Roger finally asked, his voice sounding small and distant. Richard recovered his composure first, but Helen could see how much it cost him. He bent down to collect the scattered papers, using the movement to gain time and reorganize his thoughts. "We did," he said, straightening up with deliberate slowness. "A long time ago." Helen finally found her voice, though it came out hoarse and trembling. "A long time," she echoed, as if the words were strange in her mouth. The silence that followed was as dense as melted lead. Richard couldn't take his eyes off her, mentally cataloguing every change the years had brought. The fine lines around her eyes, the way she kept her shoulders hunched as if protecting herself from invisible blows, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the sink. But beneath all the changes, she was still Helen, still the woman he had loved with an intensity that frightened him, who had carried his children in dreams that never came true, who had been the only person capable of making him believe in happy endings. "Perhaps we can continue the inspection later," Richard finally said, addressing Roger without taking his eyes off Helen. "I need to resolve a personal matter." Roger nodded quickly, clearly relieved to escape that suffocating tension. He signaled for the other men to follow him, and in a few minutes the kitchen was empty except for the two of them. Helen and Richard remained motionless, separated by only a few meters that might have been entire oceans. The air between them vibrated with electrical energy, charged with 3 decades of unspoken words, unexplained actions, and uncried tears. "Helen," he said again, and this time her name sounded like an apology. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply before responding. When she opened them again, Richard saw a strength there that didn't exist in the 17-year-old girl he had left behind. This Helen had fought battles that had transformed her, had survived tragedies that had forged her into something harder and more resilient. "Why are you here, Richard?" she asked, and he heard in the question all the others she wasn't asking. "Why now? Why did you never come back? Why did you leave me?" "Work," he answered, but they both knew it was only half the truth. "Irregularities in the administration. I didn't know, I couldn't imagine that I would be here," Helen completed, a bitter smile curving her lips. "I couldn't imagine you would appear either. It seems fate has a sense of humor." Richard took a step toward her, and she automatically backed away, pressing her back against the sink counter. The movement was instinctive, defensive, and he stopped immediately, understanding that he had lost the right to approach her without permission. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Somewhere more private?" Helen hesitated. Every survival instinct she had developed over the last 30 years screamed for her to say no, to flee as she had fled so many times before. But there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability carefully hidden behind the mask of success, that made her hesitate. "We have nothing to talk about," she finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, we do," Richard replied gently. "We have 30 years to talk about." Helen felt tears stinging her eyes and forced herself to blink rapidly to prevent them from falling. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not again. "The past is the past, Richard. Some things can't be fixed." "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but they can be explained." She studied him for a long moment, looking for signs of the young man she had loved in the face of the successful man before her. She found fragments, the way he slightly tilted his head when thinking, the way his fingers contracted when he was nervous, the small scar above his left eyebrow that he had gotten at 12 when he fell from a tree in the mansion's garden. "My shift ends at 6, she finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "There's an abandoned pier 2 miles from here following the coastal road. If you want to talk, and meet me there at 7. Richard nodded, visible relief taking over his expression. "I'll be there." Helen turned back to the sink, signaling that the conversation was over. She heard his footsteps moving away, heard the kitchen door close, but remained standing before the running water, trembling like a leaf in the wind. After so long running from the past, it had finally caught up with her, and now she didn't know whether she was more frightened by the possibility of telling the truth or by the possibility of falling in love with him again. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon when Helen finally left the resort, her hands still trembling from the day's events. Each dish she had washed after the encounter with Richard seemed to have weighed tons, each movement a battle against the emotional storm raging inside her chest. She had managed to maintain her composure in front of her co-workers, answering casual questions with monosyllables and avoiding any prolonged eye contact that might reveal the chaos that had settled in her mind. The path to the abandoned pier wound through a poorly maintained coastal road lined with native vegetation that had reclaimed much of the cracked asphalt. Helen knew this route by heart. It was one of her favorite paths for solitary walks on weekends when the solitude of the resort became too suffocating. The pier had been built decades ago to serve fishing boats, but the advance of erosion and changes in maritime currents had made it impractical. Now it remained there like a bony finger pointing to the sea, a ghostly structure that she found strangely comforting. As she walked, Helen tried to organize the thoughts that crashed in her mind like violent waves against rocks. For 30 years, she had mentally rehearsed this moment, what she would say if she ever met Richard again, how she would react, what questions she would ask. But now that the moment had come, she discovered that all the carefully planned words had disappeared, replaced by a whirlwind of emotions that left her breathless. Richard, after all these years, he still had the power to make her feel like a lovesick teenager and a wounded woman at the same time. The way he had said her name in the kitchen, carrying decades of longing in a single word, had awakened memories she thought she had buried forever. His hands intertwined with hers in forbidden corridors of the Blackwell mansion, the urgent whispers of eternal love exchanged in the dimness of secret meetings, his promise that they would run away together, that they would build a new life, far from family pressures and social differences that conspired against their love. The promise he had broken in the cruelest way possible. Helen arrived at the pier 15 minutes before the agreed time, needing the extra time to strengthen her emotional defenses. The wooden structure creaked under her feet as she walked to the end, where she sat on a pile of abandoned ropes that someone had left there years ago. The sea was rough, foaming waves breaking against the pier columns with enough force to spray salt water on her face. She closed her eyes and let the rhythmic sound of the waves calm her, breathing deeply the air laden with salt and iodine. When she heard footsteps approaching on the wooden boards, her heart raced again. She didn't need to turn around to know. It was him. She would recognize that walk anywhere in the world. Firm, determined, but now carrying a weight that didn't exist in youth. Richard stopped a few meters away, as if instinctively understanding that she needed space to feel safe. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice almost lost in the noise of the rough sea. Helen turned slowly to face him. He had exchanged the formal suit for more casual clothes, dark dress pants and a white shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Even so, he managed to look elegant and out of place at the same time, like an exiled prince trying to blend in with commoners. The sea breeze tousled his dark hair, revealing more grey strands than she had noticed in the artificial light of the kitchen. "I don't know if it was a good idea," she answered honestly, hugging her own knees in a defensive posture. Richard took a few more steps, testing the limits of her comfort zone. "Helen, I need you to know that—" "That what?" she interrupted him, a note of bitterness coloring her voice. "That you were very sorry, that you had your reasons, that it was hard for you too." The harshness in her voice made him stop completely. Richard studied her face, looking for traces of the sweet, passionate young woman he had left behind. He found fragments, but they were intertwined with scars that spoke of sufferings he could only imagine. "I never wanted to hurt you," he finally said. "I know that sounds pathetic after so long, but it's the truth. I loved you, Helen. Loved you, with an intensity that scared me. Loved, she repeated, focusing on the past tense conjugation. Good to know it was real for you, too. For a while I came to think I had made it all up in my head. Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. How can you think that? How can you doubt what we lived? Helen stood up abruptly, needing the movement to control the anger that was beginning to boil in her veins. Because you disappeared, Richard. Because when I needed you most, when our life together was depending on your courage, you simply vanished as if you had never existed. I had no choice, his voice exploded, echoing over the waves. You don't understand. There were threats, pressures that you couldn't imagine. Threats? Helen turned to him with flashing eyes. What kind of threats could be worse than abandoning the woman you claimed to love when she needed you most, Richard? Ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she immediately recognized. It was the same movement he made as a teenager, whenever he felt cornered by circumstances that escaped his control. Threats against you, he finally said. Against your family. Against our future. Helen felt the world sway slightly beneath her feet. For all these years, she had built her anger on the certainty that Richard had simply chosen his family and social position over the love they shared. The possibility that there had been external factors had never seriously crossed her mind. What kind of threats? She asked, her voice losing some of its previous hostility. Richard moved. Closer, and this time she didn't back away. The day before our escape I received a letter. Anonymous. It said that if I took you with me, something terrible would happen to your mother. Specific details about where she worked, her schedules, even the path she took home. And there were photos. Helen's blood froze. What kind of photos? Of you. Of us. Together. Richard swallowed hard before continuing. Whoever wrote that letter had been following us for weeks, maybe months. They knew about every secret meeting, every place where we met, and they made it clear that if I didn't leave alone for New York, as my father had planned, the consequences would be devastating. Helen sat heavily on the abandoned ropes, processing this information that completely changed the narrative she had constructed about that period of her life. Why did you never tell me? Why didn't you give me the chance to choose? Because I was 18 and terrified, Richard admitted, sitting next to her but maintaining a respectful distance. Because I thought I was protecting you. Because I was a coward who took the easier decision instead of the right one. Helen remained silent for long minutes, watching the waves break against the pier while assimilating this new version of events. The anger she had cultivated for decades began to transform into something more complex, a mixture of understanding and hurt that was even more difficult to process. Did you investigate who sent the letter? She finally asked. I tried. 4 years. But I never found anything concrete. Richard hesitated before continuing. I suspected my sister Carla for a while. She never approved of our relationship, considered you a threat to the family's reputation, but she swore she had nothing to do with it, and I wanted to believe her. And your family? Did your parents know about our relationship? My father suspected, but we never had an open conversation about it. My mother... Richard paused, a shadow of pain crossing his face. My mother died shortly after my departure for New York. Cancer. She had hidden the diagnosis to avoid worrying us. Helen felt an unexpected pang of sadness. Mrs. Elizabeth Blackwell had always been kind to her, one of the few people in the mansion who treated her with genuine respect despite her social position. I'm sorry, she said sincerely. She was a good woman. She was, and I'm sure she would have taken our side if she had known. Richard turned to face her. Helen, I know I can't undo the past. I know I can't recover the years we lost. But I need you to know that not a single day went by without me thinking about you. Without wondering how you were, if you were happy, if you had found someone who could love you as you deserved. His voice carried a vulnerability that Helen hadn't expected to find. The successful businessman Richard had disappeared, replaced by the young man she had loved. insecure, passionate, and desperately sincere. "And you?" she asked, noticing for the first time that he wasn't wearing a wedding ring. "Did you find someone?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "I found several someones, girlfriends, fiancés, even a wife for a few years, but none of them managed to erase you from my memory. None of them made my heart beat the way you did with just a look." Helen felt tears stinging her eyes and fought to contain them. "Why did you never come back, even as an adult after you gained independence from your family?" "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of discovering that you had moved on, that you were happy without me. Afraid of facing what I had done, and mainly afraid that you hated me so much that you wouldn't even give me the chance to explain." "I did hate you," Helen said, softly. "For years. My hatred was the only thing that kept me functioning sometimes." "And now?" Helen studied him for a long moment, noticing how the golden light of the sunset highlighted the lines of expression around his eyes, evidence of decades of responsibilities and difficult decisions. There was something about him that touched her deeply, a loneliness that mirrored her own, a sadness she recognized because she carried it too. "Now I don't know anymore," she answered honestly. "It's more complicated to hate someone after you understand their motivations." Richard felt a spark of hope light in his chest. "Helen, I know it's very presumptuous of me, but have you built a life here? A family?" The question hit Helen like a sharp blade. It was the moment she feared most, the time to decide how much of the truth she would reveal. She thought of Michael, the brilliant young man she had found a few weeks ago through a private investigation agency, the son he never knew he had. The son who was about to work for his own father's company without either of them knowing the connection. "No," she finally said, choosing a partial truth. "I never married, never had a family of my own." Richard felt relief and sadness in equal measure. Relief because it meant she hadn't found someone to replace him, sadness because it meant she had spent all these years alone. "Why not?" he asked softly. Helen looked away, focusing on the waves that continued to break against the pier with constant force. "Because some wounds never completely heal, because I never managed to trust enough to completely open myself to another person." The answer broke Richard's heart in a way he hadn't expected. Realizing that his abandonment had left such deep scars on the woman he loved was almost unbearable. "Helen, he began, but she interrupted him. "And you? Why didn't your marriage work?" Richard was silent for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "Because I never managed to truly love her. She was a good woman, came from a suitable family, had all the attributes expected of a successful businessman's wife. But when she kissed me, I closed my eyes and thought of you. When we made love, I imagined your hands, your voice whispering my name. It wasn't fair to her." The confession carried an intimacy that made Helen shiver. For all these years, she had tried to erase from memory how perfectly their bodies fit together, how each of his touches made her feel as if she were on fire inside. Hearing that he had remembered the same way awakened sensations she thought she had buried forever. "Richard," she began, but didn't know how to finish the sentence. He moved slightly closer, and she could feel the heat emanating from his body. The familiar smell of his skin mixed with an expensive masculine cologne that didn't exist in his youth. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know it may be too late for us. But I needed you to know that I never stopped loving you, not for a second." Helen felt as if the world was spinning out of control. Part of her wanted to throw herself into his arms, to allow herself to feel again the security and passion she had known only with him. But another part, the part that had learned to survive through caution and distrust, warned her of the dangers of opening her heart again. "It's a lot," she whispered. "All of this is a lot to process at once." "I understand," Richard said, forcing himself not to move closer despite every fiber of his being crying out to touch her. "I'm not expecting you to forgive me immediately, or to feel the same as I feel. I just want a chance, an opportunity to get to know the woman you've become, to show you the man I've become." Helen turned to face him completely, And for the first time since the reunion in the kitchen, she allowed herself to really look at him. The years had been kind. He was more attractive now than in his youth, maturity adding layers of complexity to his face that made him even more fascinating. But it was his eyes that hypnotized her. They still carried that intensity that had captivated her as a teenager, but now tempered with a vulnerability that spoke of losses and regrets. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "Dinners, conversations, walks on the beach." Richard hesitated before continuing. Time to get to know each other again without pressure, without expectations, just possibilities. Helen knew she should say no. She knew that allowing Richard back into her life would be opening herself to potential pain that could be even worse than what she had carried for 3 decades. But there was something in the sincerity of his voice, in the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world, that awakened a dangerous hope in her heart. "I work every day," she finally said. "Double shifts most of the time. Then late dinners, early breakfasts, any time that works for you." Helen breathed deeply, feeling as if she were about to jump off a cliff without knowing if there was water or rocks waiting below. "1 week," she finally said. "1 week to see if this makes sense." The smile that illuminated Richard's face was like the sun rising after a long night. "1 week," he agreed. "Thank you, Helen. You don't know what this means to me." Helen stood up, feeling she needed physical distance to process what she had just agreed to. "I need to go. It's late, and I have to work early tomorrow." Richard stood up too, clearly reluctant to let her leave. Can I give you a ride?" "No," she responded quickly. "I prefer to walk. I need to think." He nodded, understanding. "Tomorrow night, there's a restaurant in town, the High Tide. Do you know it?" "I know it." Helen began to walk away, but stopped and turned again. "Richard." "Yes?" "The threats you received, are you sure they stopped? That there was nothing more?" The question caught him by surprise. "Why do you ask?" Helen hesitated, thinking of the anonymous notes she had received in recent weeks, of the shadows she sometimes felt following her when she returned home late at night. "Just curiosity," she lied. "See you tomorrow." Richard watched her walk away along the coastal road until her silhouette disappeared in the growing darkness. Only then did he allow himself to truly smile, for the first time in decades. Helen had agreed to see him again. It was a beginning, a spark of hope amid the ashes of a love he had thought was dead forever. As he returned to his car, Richard didn't notice the shadowy figure watching him from behind a row of palm trees. Someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment to arrive. Someone who didn't intend to allow Helen and Richard to find the happiness they had lost so long ago. Helen walked back to the resort, with her heart beating erratically, each step echoing on the deserted road like a distant drum. The conversation with Richard had turned her world upside down in a way she hadn't expected. For 30 years, she had carried the certainty that he had abandoned her out of cowardice or selfishness. Discovering that there had been external forces working against them changed everything, and at the same time changed nothing. Because there were still secrets she couldn't tell. There was still a son who had grown up without a father, without even knowing who his biological parents were. There was still someone out there who considered their love a sufficient threat to destroy. When she finally reached her small cottage, Helen found a white envelope slipped under the door. There was no sender's name, just her name written in handwriting she didn't recognize. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and read the message inside. "Some people never learn. Some wounds from the past never heal. If you value the life you've built, keep your distance from what you lost. Otherwise, you may lose much more than last time." The paper trembled in her hands. Whoever had sent that message knew about her past with Richard, knew they had met again, and, most terrifying of all, knew where she lived. Helen carefully locked the cottage door and checked all the windows before allowing herself to sit. The familiar fear that had pursued her for years returned with full force, mixing with the dangerous hope that Richard had awakened in her heart. She thought of Michael, the son she had finally located after decades of discreet searching. A brilliant 29-year-old young man, graduated in information technology from an American university, who had returned to the United States just a few weeks ago. She had hired an investigator to find him, but still hadn't gathered enough courage to approach him. How do you introduce yourself to a son who doesn't know you? How do you explain a choice that was made out of love but resulted in abandonment? And now, with Richard back in her life and shadowy threats resurfacing from the past, she wondered if she hadn't made a terrible mistake in agreeing to see him again. Perhaps some wounds really were too deep to heal. Perhaps some loves were destined to remain incomplete. But as she prepared for bed, Helen couldn't stop thinking about the way Richard had looked at her on the pier, as if she was still the most important woman in the world to him, as if 30 years of separation were just a nightmare from which they had finally awakened. And for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to dream of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for them. Helen spent the entire night awake, tossing and turning in the narrow bed of the cottage, while her mind alternated between Richard's revelations and the anonymous threat she had found under her door. Every night noise, the wind in the palm trees, the creaking of the cottage's wood, the distant sound of waves, made her start and strain her ears for signs of danger. When she finally managed to fall asleep, shortly before dawn, she was tormented by fragmented dreams where shadowy figures chased her through endless corridors, while a distorted voice repeated the words of the threat like a sinister mantra. She woke to the alarm ringing at 5:30 in the morning, feeling more exhausted than when she had gone to bed. Her eyes were swollen and red, evidence of a poorly slept night that she tried to disguise with cold water and the few makeup products she owned. In the small, stained bathroom mirror, her reflection made her shudder. There was a fragility in her expression that she couldn't hide, a vulnerability that years of self-preservation had taught her to mask. The day at the resort passed in a fog of automatic movement. Helen performed her tasks with the mechanical efficiency she had perfected over the years, but her mind was completely detached from the work. Each sound of male footsteps in the kitchen made her raise her eyes, expecting to see Richard. Each ring of the establishment's telephone made her imagine he was cancelling dinner that night. The insecurity she thought she had overcome decades ago returned with full force, whispering cruel doubts in her mind. Perhaps he had thought better of the whole matter. Perhaps the 47-year-old woman who washed dishes didn't match the idealized memories of the young woman he had loved. Around noon, Roger appeared in the kitchen, carrying an elegant envelope addressed to her. The difference between the expensive, creamy paper and the cheap envelope of the previous night's threat was striking. "This arrived for you this morning," he said, handing her the correspondence with a curious expression. "Hand-delivered by a very well-dressed driver. Must be important." Helen felt her heart accelerate as she recognized the elegant handwriting on the envelope, the same firm, slanted writing she had memorized at 17 when Richard left love notes hidden between the pages of the books she organized in the mansion's library. With slightly trembling hands, she opened the envelope and removed a heavy paper card with a brief but meaningful message. "Helen, after our conversation yesterday, I spent the night thinking about everything we missed living. Today, I want to start making up for lost time. I had some special things brought from New York for our night. See you soon. With all my love, Richard." Attached to the card was a smaller second envelope, and when Helen opened it, she found a considerable amount of money along with another note. "So you can get ready as you deserve. I know your pride may resist, but please accept this as a gift from someone who wants to see you shine again." Helen stood for several minutes, holding the money and processing the gesture. Part of her wanted to be offended. She had learned to survive with dignity, even in simplicity, and didn't need anyone's charity. But another part, a part that had been silenced by years of necessity and self-sacrifice, whispered that perhaps it was time to allow herself to feel desired and valued. "Again? Good news?" Roger asked, clearly curious about the change of expression on her face. "Maybe," she replied, carefully folding the papers and putting them in her uniform pocket. "Roger, would it be possible for me to leave a little earlier today? I can make her up for it tomorrow by working extra hours." The manager studied her for a moment, noticing something different in her posture, an energy that hadn't been present for years. "Of course, Helen. You never ask for anything. You deserve an afternoon off. You can leave at 3 if you want." Helen thanked him and returned to work with renewed determination. At 3 o'clock sharp, she left the resort and walked to the nearby town, a small commercial center that served both local residents and tourists. It had been years since she had entered a clothing store with the purpose of buying something for herself. Her shopping was limited to essentials, practical and inexpensive pieces that lasted several washes and didn't draw attention. But that afternoon, Helen allowed herself to dream again. She tried on dresses that enhanced her still elegant silhouette despite years of hard work. She chose a navy blue model that complemented her brown eyes and disguised the small imperfections that time had brought. She also bought low-heeled shoes, a luxury she hadn't allowed herself for decades, and beauty products she had forgotten to use, lipstick in a soft color that illuminated her face, discreet but feminine perfume, cream for hands dried by constant work. When she returned to the cottage, Helen took more time getting ready than she had in years. She let her hair down from the usual bun, letting it fall in soft waves to her shoulders. The makeup was applied with care, enhancing her eyes and disguising signs of tiredness. When she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. There was a mature beauty there that she had forgotten she possessed, a femininity that years of self-preservation had forced into hibernation. The High Tide restaurant was located in the historic center of the small coastal town, in a restored colonial house that maintained the original architectural charm while offering modern comforts. Helen arrived a few minutes late, mainly because she had stopped 3 times on the way to consider going back home and canceling the entire meeting. Each step toward the restaurant seemed loaded with meaning, as if she were walking toward a future completely different from what she had planned. Richard was already waiting at a reserved table in the back of the restaurant, away from the curious glances of other customers. When he saw her approaching, the fork he was distractedly moving in the salad stopped in midair, and his expression changed to one of pure astonishment, followed by admiration. The navy blue dress enhanced every curve of her body. The loose hair framed her face in a way that vividly reminded him of the young woman he had fallen in love with. But there was a sophistication in the woman before him that transcended any memory of the past. "Helen," he said, standing up to pull out the chair for her, "you look stunning." Helen felt a blush rise up her neck. It had been so long since she had received a sincere compliment that she had almost forgotten how to react. "Thank you," she murmured, sitting down and trying to control the nervousness that made her hands tremble slightly. Richard returned to his place, but couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something almost surreal about sitting at a restaurant table with Helen after 3 decades of separation, as if time had folded in on itself, and they were simultaneously the passionate young lovers of yore and the mature adults they had become. "I hope you weren't offended by my gesture this afternoon," he said, referring discreetly to the money he had sent. "I just wanted what?" Helen interrupted him softly. "Wanted to see you shine again," Richard admitted, echoing the words of his note. "During all these years, I always imagined you like this, beautiful, elegant, confident, seeing you hidden behind that uniform, with your hair always tied up, your eyes always lowered. It broke my heart." Helen nervously fiddled with the napkin in her lap. "This isn't my real life, Richard. This," she gestured to the dress, the makeup, the refined environment of the restaurant, "is a fantasy. My reality is waking up at 5:30 in the morning to wash dishes and return to a 2-room cottage where my company is silence." "Why does it have to be that way?" Richard asked, leaning slightly toward her. "Why did you choose to live in anonymity, hiding from the world?" The question touched a wound that Helen didn't like to examine too closely. How to explain that she had spent years fleeing not only from the pain of abandonment, but also from the guilt of having given a child up for adoption? How to admit that anonymity was a form of self-punishment for decisions she had made in youth? "Sometimes it's easier to be invisible," she responded evasively. "Less complicated, less painful." Richard studied her expression, perceiving that there were layers of suffering there that transcended his abandonment. "Helen, What happened after I left? I know my absence hurt you, but there's something more, isn't there? Something you're not telling me." Helen felt her stomach contract. The moment she had feared since she agreed to see him again had arrived, the time when she would have to decide how much of the truth she was willing to reveal. She looked around the restaurant, noticing other couples talking quietly, families, sharing meals, a normal world functioning around them while she was about to navigate treacherous emotional waters. "Richard," she began, but was interrupted by the arrival of the waiter. They placed their order in an atmosphere of growing tension, both aware that an important conversation had been postponed, but not forgotten. Richard chose a bottle of red wine, hoping the alcohol might relax Helen's defenses and encourage her to open up more. When they were finally alone again, Richard tried a different approach. "Do you remember our favorite place in the mansion?" he asked. "The small winter garden at the back of the property?" A nostalgic smile curved Helen's lips. "The abandoned greenhouse with the plants your great-grandmother had collected. You used to meet me there after I finished helping my mother with the cleaning." It was the only place where we could be truly alone, Richard remembered, his voice carrying the sweetness of memory. Where our social differences didn't matter, where we were just Richard and Helen, two young people in love. "I kept some of the flowers you gave me," Helen confessed, surprising herself with the admission. "Pressed between the pages of my diary. For years I carried that diary with me until—" She stopped, realizing she was approaching dangerous territory. "Until what?" Richard gently pressed. Helen took a sip of wine, feeling the liquid slightly burn her throat and give her courage to continue. "Until I needed to burn everything. All the memories, all the evidence that we had existed together. It was necessary." "Why? Was it necessary?" Richard felt a growing tension in his chest. "Helen, what happened that forced you to erase our past?" Helen closed her eyes for a moment, fighting against years of self-preservation instinct that had taught her never to reveal more than absolutely necessary. But there was something in Richard's eyes, a sincerity, a vulnerability, that made her want to trust him again. "After you left," she began slowly, "I discovered I was pregnant." The world stopped for Richard. The fork he was bringing to his mouth remained suspended in the air, his eyes widened in an expression of absolute shock. For several seconds, he remained completely motionless, as if his brain refused to process the information he had just received. "Pregnant," he repeated, the word coming out as a hoarse whisper. 3 weeks after you left," Helen confirmed, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "At first I thought it was just stress, sadness. But when the certainty came—" "Why did you never tell me?" Richard asked, and Helen could hear decades of anguish, condensed in those 5 words. "How? You had completely disappeared. Nobody knew where you had gone, for how long you would be. Far away if you intended to return." Helen paused, remembering the hopelessness of those first months. "And there were the threats." "What threats?" "Similar to the ones you received. Anonymous notes, silent phone calls, the constant feeling of being watched." Helen wrapped both hands around the wine glass, as if she needed the warmth to warm herself. "Whoever conspired to separate us hadn't given up. The threats intensified when my pregnancy began to show." Richard felt a fury growing in his chest, an anger so intense that he had to force himself to keep his voice controlled. "What kind of threats?" "They said that if I tried to contact you, something terrible would happen to the baby, that accidents could happen to careless pregnant women, that sometimes babies are born dead without apparent reason." Helen shuddered, as she recalled the cruel words that had tormented her. "I was scared alone, 19 years old and 6 months pregnant." 19 years old, Richard repeated, making mental calculations. "You found out you were pregnant at 18, alone, without support." "My mother was dying of tuberculosis," Helen continued, her voice beginning to falter. "The public health system was chaos. I had no money for private treatment, and the threats wouldn't stop. They said that if I told anyone about the pregnancy, my mother would also suffer the consequences." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. For all these years, he had carried the guilt of having abandoned Helen, but had never imagined that she was facing such a desperate situation alone. "What happened to the baby?" he asked, although part of him already knew the answer would be painful. Helen was silent for so long that Richard began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I had the baby, a boy, beautiful, healthy, perfect." Tears began to roll down her cheeks, and she quickly wiped them away with the napkin. "But I couldn't keep him. The threats were too real, too specific. Whoever was persecuting us had resources, connections, the ability to cause real harm. You gave him up for adoption," Richard concluded, his own voice choked with emotion. "To a family I never met, a completely anonymous process, through an agency that guaranteed there would be no way to trace the connection." Helen paused, struggling to control the tears. It was the only way to protect him. It was the only way to ensure that he would grow up safe, away from all this darkness. Richard abruptly stood up from the table, needing movement to process the emotional devastation that was descending upon him. He walked to the restaurant window that faced the street, resting his hands on the sill and breathing deeply. A son. He had had a son with Helen, a son who had grown up without knowing his parents, without knowing that he had been the fruit of an intense love that had been destroyed by external forces. A son who was now an adult man, living somewhere in the world completely unaware of the circumstances of his birth. How old would he be now? Richard asked without turning around. 29 years old, Helen responded immediately. It was a date she had never forgotten. Did you ever try to find him?" Helen hesitated. This was the part of the truth that most terrified her to reveal. "Recently, yes. I hired a private investigator. After years of wondering if it was the right thing to do, I finally decided that he deserved to know we exist." Richard turned to face her, a dangerous hope shining in his eyes. "Did you find him?" "I found him," Helen admitted. "He's well, more than well. He's brilliant, educated, successful. The family that adopted him did a wonderful job." "Where is he? What does he do?" Helen breathed deeply, preparing for the revelation that would change everything. "He works with technology. He studied in the United States but recently returned. He's a specialist in innovation systems for large companies." Richard felt a strange familiarity in the description. Something about the professional profile sounded familiar, but he couldn't identify exactly. "What's his name?" he asked. "Michael," Helen answered. "Michael Sanders." The name hit Richard like lightning. Michael Sanders. The brilliant young man his company had just hired as the new director of innovation. The young man who had impressed everyone on the recruitment team with his exceptional intelligence and revolutionary ideas. The man who was scheduled to start working at the New York headquarters next week. "My God," Richard whispered, quickly returning to the table. "Michael Sanders, 29 years old, technology graduate from the United States." Helen stared at him in surprise. "You know him?" "He's going to work for me," Richard said, his voice laden with astonishment. "We just hired him as director of innovation. He starts next week." The silence that followed was absolute. Helen and Richard looked at each other across the table, processing the statistical impossibility and poetic perfection of the situation. Their son, the son they had lost before even knowing him, was about to work for the father who never knew he had him. "This is," Helen began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "Destiny," Richard completed. "It has to be destiny." He stood up, again, but this time went to Helen, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "Helen, we can meet him. We can tell him the truth. We can be a family." Helen felt panic rising in her throat. "It's not that simple, Richard. He doesn't know we exist. He might hate us for having abandoned him. He might not want to know about us. Or he might be grateful to finally know his real story," Richard argued. "Helen, this is our chance to correct the mistakes of the past, to be the parents we always wanted to be." "And if he rejects us? If the truth destroys the life he's built?" Richard squeezed her hands more tightly. "Then we'll face that together, as we should have faced everything from the beginning." Helen looked into his eyes and saw there a determination that didn't exist in his youth, a maturity forged by years of responsibility and difficult decisions. But she also saw the same love that had captivated her decades ago, only intensified by time and losses. "There's one more thing," she said reluctantly. "The threats. They're back." Richard tensed immediately. "What do you mean they're back?" "Anonymous. Note, someone knows we've met again. Someone doesn't want us to be together again." Helen took from her purse the note she had found the night before and handed it to Richard. He read the message with growing fury, recognizing the same sinisterly vague tone of the threats he had received in his youth. "This ends now," he said, with conviction. "I'm going to hire the best private investigators in the country. We're going to find out who's behind this and end this persecution once and for all." "Richard, it could be dangerous if we stir up the past too much." "The past is already stirring us," he interrupted her. "I'm not going to lose you again, Helen. I'm not going to lose the chance to meet our son. Whoever is trying to separate, thus I'll discover their identity and make them pay for every tear you shed, for every night of sleep you lost, for every year of happiness they stole from us." Helen felt a mixture of fear and hope running through her veins. Part of her still wanted to flee, to hide again in the anonymity that protected her. But another part, a part that had been dormant for 3 decades, was beginning to awaken with the possibility of having back everything she had lost. "If we do this," she finally said, "we have to be prepared for the consequences. Whoever our persecutor is, they have resources and determination. They won't easily give up." "Then let them come," Richard responded, standing up and extending his hand to her. "This time we'll face everything together." Helen looked at the extended hand, the same hand that had held hers during secret walks through the mansion's gardens, the same hand that had caressed her face while whispering promises of eternal love. She hesitated for only a moment before intertwining her fingers with his. When they left the restaurant together, neither of them noticed the shadowy figure watching them from a car parked across the street. Someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Someone who had no intention of allowing Helen and Richard to find the happiness that had been denied them so long ago. The figure's phone vibrated, and a distorted voice answered on the other end. "They're together again," the figure reported. "And from what I could hear, they've discovered about the son." "Then it's time to accelerate the plans," the voice responded. "We can't allow the truth to come out. There's too much at stake." "What do you want me to do?" "For now, continue. Observing, but be prepared. If they get too close to the truth, we'll have to take more drastic measures." The call ended, and the shadowy figure continued watching. As Richard and Helen walked down the street, their hands intertwined as a symbol of renewed hope. But hope, as both would soon discover, is sometimes the most dangerous emotion of all. Dawn found Richard walking around his penthouse apartment in New York, unable to sleep since he had returned from the coast the night before. The panoramic view of the city stretched before him, but his eyes didn't see the illuminated skyscrapers or the constant movement of the avenues below. His mind was completely focused on the previous day's revelations and the plan he had begun to form during the return trip. Michael Saunders, his son, the son he never knew he had, who had grown up a few miles away without him ever suspecting the connection between them. Richard had spent hours during the night discreetly researching the new employee, reading his detailed resume, studying the brilliant recommendations from his American professors, analyzing the interviews he had given to the company recruiters. Every word confirmed what Helen had said. Michael was exceptional, brilliant, a young man who had exceeded all academic and professional expectations. But there was something else that caught Richard's attention. In the official photographs of the hiring process, there was a disturbing familiarity in Michael's features. The firm line of the jaw that Richard recognized when he looked in the mirror, the grey-blue eyes that were identical to his own, the way he smiled slightly to the side when thinking, all were genetic echoes impossible to ignore. How had he not noticed before? How had none of his assistants commented on the resemblance? The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts, and he answered without checking who was calling, assuming it was Helen. "Richard?" The female voice on the other end of the line was familiar, but not the one he expected to hear. "Carla?" Richard frowned, surprised to receive a call from his sister. So early. It's 7 in the morning. What's happening? I need to speak with you urgently, Carla said, and there was a tension in her voice that made Richard straighten up. About your little romantic reunion on the coast. About Helen Morris. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. How do you know about Helen? I know many things, my dear brother, more than you imagine. Carla's voice carried a coldness he didn't recognize. I'm coming over. Don't leave the apartment until I get there. The call ended before Richard could respond. He stood for several minutes, holding the phone and trying to process the threatening tone in his sister's voice. Carla had always been possessive regarding the family, obsessed with the Blackwell reputation, but there was something in the call that left him deeply uneasy. While waiting for his sister's arrival, Richard called Helen, needing to hear her voice to calm down. Hello? Helen answered after several rings, her voice hoarse from sleep. It's me, Richard said. Sorry to wake you so early, but I needed to talk. Is everything all right? You sound tense. My sister called. She knows about us, about our reunion. Richard walked to the window, watching the morning traffic beginning to form. She's coming here to talk, and I don't know why, but I feel it won't be a friendly conversation. Helen was silent for a moment. Richard, do you trust your sister? The question caught him by surprise. Of course I trust her. Why do you ask? Because someone knew about our relationship 30 years ago. Someone had sufficient resources to threaten us, to pursue us, to make you leave without telling me. Helen paused before continuing. And that same someone knows we've met again now. The implication in Helen's words hit Richard like a slap. Carla, his own sister, who had always disapproved of the relationship, who considered Helen a threat, to the family reputation, who had insisted he leave for New York when the pressures began. No, he said, but there was doubt in his voice. Carla can be controlling, but she would never do something so cruel. Maybe it's time to find out how far she would go to protect the family's interests, Helen gently suggested. Before Richard could respond, he heard the doorbell of the apartment. She's here. Helen, be careful today. If my suspicions are right, I'll be fine. You're the one who needs to be careful. If Carla really was behind the threats, we don't know how far she's willing to go now. Richard ended the call and walked to the door, breathing deeply before opening it. Carla was in the hallway, elegant as always in an impeccable beige suit, but there was something in her posture that radiated tension. At 52, she had become a harder version of herself, with sharp features that seemed sculpted by ambition and control. Carla, Richard greeted, giving her a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. Come in. She passed by him toward the living room, her high heels clicking against the marble floor with the precision of a metronome. Richard noticed she was carrying a black leather folder, the kind she used for important business meetings. Do you offer coffee? She asked, sitting in one of the leather armchairs without waiting for an invitation. Of course. Richard headed to the kitchen, using the time to organize his thoughts. When he returned with 2 cups of coffee, Carla had opened the folder and spread some documents on the coffee table. What is this? Richard asked, handing her a cup. Evidence, Carla responded coldly. Evidence that Helen Morris is not who you think she is. Richard sat in the opposite armchair, studying his sister's expression. Explain. Carla picked up the first document from the pile. Did you know she used at least 5 different identities over the last 20 years? That she worked as a waitress in Boston, a cook in Portland, a saleswoman in Chicago, always under false names? People have reasons for wanting to restart their lives, Richard responded cautiously. Did you know she was committed to a psychiatric clinic for 6 months in 2005? Treatment for psychotic episodes, severe depression, suicidal tendencies. Richard felt his stomach contract. How did you get this information? I have my resources, Carla responded evasively. The question is, why did she never tell you about this? Why does she hide so many secrets about her past? Maybe because she went through traumas she prefers not to relive, Richard suggested, but doubt was growing in his mind. Carla picked up another document. And what about the son she says she had? Have you verified if that story is true? Why would she lie about something like that? To manipulate you, to awaken your pity and guilt. Carla leaned toward him. Richard, this woman appears in your life after 30 years, at the exact moment you're expanding the business to the Florida coast. She tells a tragic story about a lost son, about mysterious threats. Don't you find it too convenient? Richard abruptly stood up, walking to the window. Part of him completely rejected Carla's insinuations, but another part, the rational part that had built a business empire, recognized that there were aspects of Helen's story that didn't make complete sense. What are you suggesting? He asked without turning around. That she's using you, that she discovered your wealth and decided to take advantage of the past connection to gain financial advantage. Carla paused before the final blow, and that perhaps there never was any son. The accusation hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He turned to face his sister, seeing in her a cold determination that frightened him. Do you have evidence of this? I have enough doubts to justify a deeper investigation. Carla reorganized the papers in the folder. Richard, I know you loved her. I know part of you still has feelings for her, but you can't let nostalgia compromise your judgment. Richard returned to the armchair, picking up some of the documents to examine them more closely. The information was too detailed to be fabricated, but there was something about the way Carla had obtained it that bothered him. How did you get all this so quickly? He asked. Helen and I just met again 2 days ago. Carla hesitated for a fraction of a second, time enough for Richard to notice. I have investigators working for me for years, monitoring potential threats to the family business. Threats? Helen was washing dishes in a rundown resort. What kind of threat did she represent? The kind that appears at the right moment with the right story to manipulate a successful and lonely man, Carla responded without blinking. Richard studied his sister's face, looking for signs of lying. Carla had always been good at hiding her emotions, a skill she had perfected during years in the family business boardrooms. But there was something in her eyes, a carefully controlled anxiety, that made him suspicious. Carla, he said slowly, were you behind the threats I received 30 years ago? The question caught Carla off guard. For a moment her mask of control slipped, revealing an expression of panic that she quickly hid. What threats? She asked, but her voice sounded forced. The anonymous letter I received on the eve of the planned escape with Helen. The threats against her and her family if I didn't leave alone for New York. Richard leaned toward her. You knew about our relationship. You disapproved. You had access to the necessary resources to pursue us. Carla abruptly stood up, walking to the window as if she needed air. Richard, you're confusing family protection with malicious conspiracy. I did what I thought necessary to protect our future. Finally confessing. Carla turned to face him, and for the first time in decades, Richard saw vulnerability in her eyes. I protected you from a mistake that would have destroyed everything our family worked for generations. Helen was the housekeeper's daughter, Richard, the housekeeper's daughter. Can you imagine the scandal if you had married, what that would have done to our reputation, our business? So you admit you were behind the threats. I admit that I took measures to ensure that you made the right choice. Carla returned to the armchair, recomposing her posture. And it was the right choice. Look where you are, Richard. Look at the empire you've built. Do you think you would have accomplished all this carrying the weight of an unsuitable marriage? Richard felt a fury growing in his chest, an anger so intense that he had to force himself to keep his voice controlled. You destroyed my happiness. You separated me from the woman I loved. You made me live with guilt for 30 years. I saved you from a mediocre life, Carla replied coldly. And now she's back, as I knew she would be, trying to take advantage of your success. And the current threats? The anonymous notes Helen has been receiving. Carla was silent for a moment too long. Maybe she's making this up to gain your sympathy. Or maybe you're still trying to separate us. The accusation hung in the air between them like a sharp blade. Richard studied his sister's expression, seeing there a coldness he had never noticed before. How had he been blind for so many years to Carla's true nature? "If you continue pursuing Helen," Richard finally said, his voice carrying an authority that admitted no contestation, "you will cease to be part of this family and this business. I'm serious, Carla." Carla stood up, collecting the documents with precise movements. "You're making a mistake, Richard. A mistake that could cost very dearly. The only mistake I made was trusting you for all these years." Carla stopped at the door, turning for a final observation. "When she disappoints you again, don't say I didn't warn you." The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the sound echoed in the apartment like a gunshot. Richard remained motionless for several minutes, processing the conversation and its implications. Carla had admitted to being responsible for the past threats, but there was something in her denial about the current threats that didn't completely convince him. He picked up the phone and dialed Helen, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again with the same result. An anxiety began to grow in his chest. What if Carla had decided to accelerate her plans? What if Helen was in danger at this exact moment? Richard grabbed his car keys, deciding to immediately return to the coast, when his phone rang. It was Martha, his secretary. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "Michael Sanders arrived early for today's meeting. He's waiting in the conference room." Richard stopped halfway to the door. Michael. His son was there in the building, a few meters away. The timing coincidence seemed cruel. On the same day he discovered that Carla had conspired against his happiness, he would have to face the son he had never known without being able to reveal the truth. "Tell him I'll be down in 5 minutes," Richard responded, forcing professionalism into his voice. He walked to the bathroom, washing his face with cold water and trying to organize his thoughts. How to look at Michael without his emotions betraying him. How to conduct a normal business meeting, knowing he was before the son he had lost before even knowing him. When Richard entered the conference room 5 minutes later, Michael Sanders was standing before the window, observing the city view. When he turned to greet him, Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The resemblance was undeniable. Michael had his height, the same bone structure, the same grey-blue eyes. But there was something of Helen there too. The delicate shape of his hands, the soft curve of his lips when he smiled, a natural elegance in his movements that could only have come from her. "Mr. Blackwell," Michael said, extending his hand, with a warm smile. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." Richard shook his son's hand, feeling an overwhelming emotion upon touching the skin that carried his own DNA. "The pleasure is mine, Michael. I've heard impressive things about your work." "I hope I can live up to the expectations," Michael responded, and there was a genuine humility in his voice that deeply touched Richard. They sat at the conference table, and Richard struggled to maintain focus on the presentation Michael had prepared about innovation systems for the company. But as he listened to the young man speak passionately about technology and efficiency, Richard could only think about how proud he was of him, how he wanted to embrace him and tell him he was his father, how he wished to recover all the lost years. "And I believe that with these implementations, we can increase operational efficiency by at least 30%, Michael was saying. "Impressive," Richard commented, forcing himself to pay attention. "And you developed these ideas during your studies in the United States?" "Some of them, yes, but many came from my personal experience trying to understand complex systems." Michael hesitated before continuing. "Sir, may I make a personal observation?" Richard nodded, curious. "When I received the offer to work here, I extensively researched the company and you, and I noticed something strange. There's a notable physical resemblance between us. Some people even commented on it. Is it coincidence?" The question caught Richard completely off guard. He felt his heart accelerate and needed a few seconds to find his voice. "Sometimes the world is smaller than we imagine," he responded evasively. "Perhaps we have common ancestors somewhere in the past." Michael smiled, seeming to accept the explanation. "Probably. Well, anyway, I'm eager to start working. This company has an exceptional reputation. And you have a bright future here," Richard assured, and the words carried much more meaning than Michael could imagine. The meeting continued for another hour, with Michael presenting innovative ideas that genuinely impressed Richard. The young man was brilliant, articulate, full of an energy that reminded Richard of himself in his youth. But there was something more, a natural kindness, a consideration for others that he recognized as coming from Helen. When the meeting ended, Richard accompanied Michael to the reception. "Do you have a place to stay here in New York?" he asked. "I have a temporary apartment, nothing very sophisticated, but it serves." Michael hesitated before continuing. "Mr. Blackwell, may I ask something? It's about my hiring." "Of course." "When I learned I was being considered for this position, I was surprised. My resume is good, but there are many qualified professionals in the market. Why me?" The question touched Richard's heart. How to explain that there was something about the young man that attracted him inexplicably, a connection that transcended professional qualifications? "Because sometimes we recognize potential even before we completely understand where it comes from," Richard answered honestly. Michael smiled, seeming satisfied with the response. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir. I won't disappoint you." "I'm sure you won't." Richard watched him leave the building, feeling a mixture of paternal pride and sadness for the lost opportunity to know his son during all these years. When Michael disappeared into the street crowd, Richard returned to his office and immediately called Helen again. This time she answered, but there was tension in her voice. "Richard, thank God. I tried to call you several times, but is everything all right?" he interrupted, concerned. "I don't know. Strange things have been happening since this morning. I found my cottage ransacked when I returned from work. Nothing was stolen, but someone was here. And there's a strange car parked on the road for hours with someone watching me." Richard felt panic rising in his throat. "Get out of there now. Go to a public place full of people. I'm coming there." "Richard, there's one more thing. I received a phone call this morning, a voice I didn't recognize, but that said something that froze my blood." "What did they say?" "That if I didn't stop looking for the past, Michael would suffer the consequences." The world stopped for Richard. Whoever was behind the threats now knew about Michael, knew he was their son, and was willing to use this information as a weapon. "Helen, listen to me carefully," Richard said, forcing calm into his voice. "Take only the essentials and leave there immediately. Go to the resort. Stay surrounded by people. I'm leaving New York now. We're going to resolve this once and for all." "And, Michael, how will we protect him if we don't even know where he is?" Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "I know where he is. I just met with him." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. You've already met him?" Helen finally asked, her voice full of emotion. "Yes. And Helen?" "He's perfect. He's everything we could have dreamed our son would become." Helen began to cry, tears of joy mixed with fear for the uncertain future that awaited them. "Richard, I'm afraid, not for myself but for him. If something happens to Michael because of us—" "Nothing will happen," Richard said with iron determination. "I promise you, Helen, I'll protect our family even if it costs everything I've built." As Richard left the building toward the parking lot, neither he nor Helen realized it was already too late. On the other side of the city, Michael Sanders was being followed by two men who had received very specific orders about what to do if the son began to ask inconvenient questions about his origins. And in an elegant mansion in Upper East Side, Carla Blackwell was finishing a phone call with instructions that sealed the fate of everyone involved. "Do whatever is necessary," she said coldly, "but I want it to look like an accident." Michael Sanders noticed he was being followed when he left the Blackwell Corporation building. Initially, he thought it was paranoia, a side effect of the anxiety he always felt in new jobs. But when he noticed the same dark car appearing behind him for the third time in 15 minutes, he knew something was wrong. His years in the United States had taught him to be observant, especially after some xenophobia incidents he had faced as a foreign student. The intense New York traffic in late afternoon provided perfect cover for anyone wanting to follow someone discreetly, but Michael had learned some basic counter-surveillance techniques during a personal security course he had taken in Boston. He made some unnecessary turns, doubled back on the same route, and turned down dead-end streets. The dark car was still there, always maintaining the same distance. Michael felt a mixture of adrenaline and confusion running through his veins. Why would someone be following him? He had no enemies, didn't owe money to anyone, wasn't involved in any situation that would justify this kind of pursuit. The only different thing in his recent life had been his hiring by Richard Blackwell's company. Could there be some connection? Deciding to take action, Michael stopped at a busy coffee shop on a commercial avenue, parking in front of the large glass windows where he would be easily visible. If his pursuers wanted something with him, they would have to expose themselves. He ordered a coffee and sat at a strategic table from where he could observe the street. The dark car stopped across the avenue, and Michael could make out two men in the front seat. They didn't leave the vehicle, but one of them was talking on the phone. Michael took out his cell phone and discreetly photographed the car's license plate, sending the image to a friend who worked as a private investigator, a precaution he had learned to take whenever he felt threatened. It was then that his phone rang. The number was unknown, but he answered anyway. Michael Sanders. The voice on the other end was female, educated, but there was a coldness that made him shiver. Who's speaking? Someone who has information about your true family, about your biological parents. Michael almost dropped his coffee. Throughout his life, he had wondered about his origins. His adoptive parents had been wonderful, but they had always been honest about the fact that he had been adopted as a baby. Attempts to discover more about his biological family had always run into sealed documents and anonymous adoption processes. How did you get my number? What do you know about my family? I know that your biological mother works washing dishes a few hours from New York. I know that your biological father is the man who just hired you, and I know that both are in great danger because of secrets from the past. The world stopped for Michael. Richard Blackwell was his father. The physical resemblance he had noticed during the meeting, the strange familiarity he had felt, the inexplicable sense of connection, it all made sense now. You're lying, he said, but his voice betrayed the certainty that it wasn't a lie. I'm sending some photos to your phone. Photos of your parents when they were young, together in love. Photos that prove everything I'm saying. Michael's phone vibrated, and he opened the messages with trembling hands. The first images left him breathless. Richard and a beautiful young woman embracing in a garden, looking at each other with an intensity that was impossible to fake. The woman had delicate features that Michael recognized when he looked in the mirror, the same curve of the lips, the same expressive eyes. My God, he whispered. Your real name is Michael Blackwell Morris, the voice continued. You were separated from your parents before you were even born by people who considered their love a threat. And now, when they finally met again, these same people want to prevent the truth from coming to light. What people? Why are you telling me this? Because you have the right to know who you are, and because your parents need your help. They are in danger at this very moment. Michael felt panic rising in his throat. What kind of danger? Your mother is being pursued on the Florida coast. Your father is rushing to protect her, but he may be walking into a trap. And you, the voice made a dramatic pause, are being followed by men who received orders to ensure you never discover the truth. Michael looked through the coffee shop window and saw that one of the men had left the car and was walking in his direction. His survival instinct kicked in. What do you want from me? He asked quickly. For you to go to the Golden Coast Resort on the Florida coast, to find your parents before it's too late, to help protect them from the people who want to destroy your family. And if this is a trap, if you're working for these people you mentioned, then you'll die without knowing who you really are, the woman responded coldly. But if it's not, you'll have the chance to save the two people who loved you most in the world, even though they had to give you up to protect you. The call ended, leaving Michael alone with his turbulent emotions and an impossible decision to make. The man who had left the car was now a few meters from the coffee shop, and Michael could see there was something protruding under his jacket, probably a weapon. Michael made a quick decision. He left through the coffee shop's back door, which led to a parallel street where he had left his motorcycle parked. His years of riding through New York's chaotic streets gave him an advantage over any car pursuer, and he knew shortcuts that no GPS registered. As he accelerated toward the highway that led to Florida, Michael tried to process the revelations that had turned his life upside down. Richard Blackwell was his father. That morning's meeting took on a completely different meaning. The way Richard had looked at him, the personal questions, the strange emotionality he had perceived beneath the professional posture. And his mother was in danger, a woman he had never known, but who had made the most difficult decision of her life by giving him up to protect him. Michael felt a mixture of anger at having been deprived of knowing his parents, and gratitude for having been raised with love and security by his adoptive parents. The journey to Florida had never seemed so long. Michael pushed the motorcycle to the speed limit, stopping only once to refuel and check if he wasn't being followed. Throughout the trip, his phone rang insistently, some unknown numbers he didn't answer, and several calls from Richard Blackwell, which he also ignored until he was sure what kind of situation he was facing. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, Helen followed Richard's instructions and had taken refuge in the common area of the resort, surrounded by guests and employees. But the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. Even in the middle of the crowd, she felt invisible eyes following her every movement. Roger, the manager, noticed her agitation and approached. "Helen, are you okay? You seem nervous." "I'm having some personal problems," she responded evasively. "Roger, if someone comes here looking for me, can you say I don't work here anymore?" The manager frowned, concerned. "What kind of problems? Are you in danger?" Helen hesitated. Roger was a good man, but involving him in her problems could put him at risk too. "It's complicated, just, if anyone asks, you haven't seen me today." Before Roger could respond, Helen heard a familiar voice coming from the resort reception, a voice that made her freeze with dread. "I'm looking for Helen Morris. I know she works here." It was Carla. Helen immediately recognized the educated but authoritarian voice of Richard's sister. She hid behind a column, watching as Carla talked to the receptionist. Even after so many years, Carla remained elegant and imposing, but there was something sinister in her posture that Helen didn't remember from youth. "Roger," Helen urgently whispered, "the woman at reception. Don't let her know I'm here." Roger looked in the indicated direction and then back at Helen. "Is she causing you problems?" "She and others. Please, trust me." Roger nodded and walked to the reception, intercepting Carla before she could question more employees. Helen took advantage of the distraction to discreetly exit through the side door that led to the parking lot. She needed to find a safe place to wait for Richard to arrive, but as she was crossing the parking lot, two men emerged from behind a parked car, blocking her path. "Helen Morris?" one of them asked, and she noticed that both had postures suggesting military or police training. "You're mistaken," she responded, trying to go around them, but they moved to block her passage again. "We're not mistaken. You need to come with us. I'm not going anywhere with you." The first man sighed as if it were a routine situation. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Helen looked around, searching for an escape route. The parking lot was relatively empty, and shouting probably wouldn't help. They seemed like professionals accustomed to dealing with situations like this. It was then that she heard the roar of a motorcycle approaching at high speed. The bike entered the parking lot skidding, and the rider removed his helmet, revealing a young face that made Helen's heart stop. It was like looking at Richard at 20. The same grey-blue eyes, the same strong bone structure, but with softer features that she recognized as her own. Michael, her son, had arrived. "Mom!" he shouted, using the word he had never had the chance to say before. The two men turned, momentarily, confused by the interruption. Michael took advantage of the distraction to accelerate the motorcycle directly toward them, forcing them to dodge. Helen ran toward the bike, and Michael helped her climb on behind him. "Hold tight!" he shouted, accelerating out of the parking lot, while the men shouted and ran toward their own car. Helen wrapped her arms around her son's waist, feeling an overwhelming emotion at touching him for the first time since he was born. Even in the midst of danger, even running for their lives, she felt a completeness she hadn't experienced for decades. "How did you find me?" she shouted over the noise of the bike. "A woman called. She told me about you and my father. Said you were in danger." Helen felt a chill. Who had told Michael the truth, and why? What woman? "I don't know. But she knew everything. About my adoption, about you, about people who want to hurt us." Michael drove skillfully along the coastal roads, but Helen could see in the rear-view mirror that they were being followed. The men's car was gaining ground, and she knew the motorcycle couldn't keep them ahead indefinitely. "Michael," she said, "we need to find your father. He's coming here, but he may be walking into a trap." "Where is he?" "Probably on the road from New York. He said he would leave as soon as he knew I was in danger." Michael made a quick decision, turning onto a secondary road that led back to the main highway. "We'll intercept him. But first I need to know the truth. Are you really my mother? Is Richard Blackwell really my father?" Helen felt tears burning her eyes. "Yes, and I'm sorry, Michael. I'm sorry for giving you up, for not fighting harder to keep you with me." "Why did you do it?" "Because I loved you too much to expose you to the danger that surrounded us. Because I wanted you to have a normal, safe life, away from all this madness." Michael slowed down slightly, processing the information. "And the danger still exists?" "Yes, the same people who separated us 30 years ago still want to prevent us from being a family." They reached the main highway just as they saw a silver Mercedes coming at high speed in the opposite direction. Helen immediately recognized Richard's car. "It's him," she shouted. Michael made a dangerous U-turn on the highway, following Richard's car while trying to get his attention. It was then that Helen saw what had frightened them: two dark cars following Richard at a distance that suggested professional coordination. "They're surrounding your father," she said. "We have to warn him." Michael accelerated, approaching. Richard's car and honking insistently. Richard finally noticed them in the rearview mirror, and Helen saw his expression of shock when he recognized them. Richard slowed down, allowing the motorcycle to approach. Through the open window, he shouted, "There are two cars following me. They have guns." As if on cue, one of the pursuing cars accelerated, trying to overtake Richard and force him to stop. Michael reacted instinctively, positioning the motorcycle between the attacking car and Richard's Mercedes. What followed was a high-speed chase along the coastal roads, with Michael using the motorcycle's agility to protect his father, while Helen clung to him, praying they would survive those crucial minutes. It was when they saw the lights of a police station ahead that Richard made a desperate decision. He accelerated directly toward the station, honking and flashing his headlights to draw attention. Michael followed him, and the pursuing cars, seeing the approach of authority, slowed down and took a side exit, disappearing into the darkness. Richard stopped the car in front of the police station, and Michael parked the motorcycle beside it. For a few moments the three remained motionless, catching their breath and processing what had just happened. Then Richard got out of the car and walked to the motorcycle. His eyes were fixed on Michael, studying every detail of his son's face, as if memorizing every feature. "Michael," he said, and the word carried decades of unexpressed love. Michael completely removed his helmet and got off the motorcycle, facing his father for the first time, knowing who he really was. "Dad," he responded, and the word sounded natural, as if it had been made to be said. Richard approached and, without hesitation, enveloped his son in an embrace that lasted several minutes. Helen watched the scene with tears freely rolling down. Her face, it was the moment she had dreamed of but never imagined could actually happen. When they finally separated, Richard extended his hand to Helen, pulling her to join them. For the first time in 3 decades, the family was reunited. "How did you find out?" Richard asked Michael. "A woman called. She said you were in danger and told me the truth about who I am." Richard and Helen exchanged concerned looks. "What woman?" Richard asked. Before Michael could answer, Richard's phone rang. It was Carla. "Hello, dear brother." Her voice sounded triumphant. "I hope you enjoyed our little game of cat and mouse." "Was it you who told Michael?" Richard asked, putting the phone on speaker so the others could hear. "Of course it was me. I thought it was time for everyone to know the truth, especially Michael, who deserves to know what kind of people his biological parents are." "What kind of people?" Helen asked, approaching the phone. The charming Helen joins the conversation. "What a touching family reunion." Carla's voice dripped with venom. "What kind of people? The kind that abandons a child to pursue romantic fantasies. The kind that places personal gratification above family responsibility." "You lied to all of us for 30 years, Richard said. "You destroyed our family." "I protected our family." "You think I did all this out of cruelty. I did it because I knew this relationship was destined to fail, and I was right. Look where you are now. Running from pursuers, putting Michael in danger, destroying everything I built to maintain our reputation intact." Michael approached the phone. "And who are you to decide what's best for my life?" Carla laughed, a cold and calculated sound. "I'm the person who ensured you had a quality education, a stable family, opportunities you would never have had if you had grown up with teenage, troubled parents." "You had no right," Michael replied with a firmness that surprised everyone. "You stole 30 years from our family, 30 years we can never recover. And now that you've satisfied your morbid curiosity, I hope you have the decency to separate again. Richard has responsibilities, an empire to manage. He can't afford to destroy everything for romantic nostalgia." "I will never separate from her again," Richard said with absolute conviction. "I will never separate from my son again. And you, Carla, will never be part of my life again." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that they thought Carla had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a coldness that made them shiver. "Then you've chosen the hard way. I can't say I'm surprised. You were always too stubborn for your own good." "What does that mean?" Richard asked. "It means that if you can't make the sensible decision on your own, perhaps you need a little external motivation. Michael works for you now, doesn't he, Richard? It would be a shame if something happened to his promising future in the company. It would be a shame if certain information about his origins reached the wrong ears." "You wouldn't dare, Richard, I said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "I've done worse things, dear brother, and I'll do them again if necessary. You have 24 hours to decide. Either you return to your separate lives, or you face the consequences of defying someone who has much more power and resources than you imagine." The call ended, leaving the three in tense silence. Michael was the first to speak. "Is she bluffing?" Richard looked at Helen, seeing in her face the same concern he felt. "I don't know. Carla has always been determined, but I've never seen her so cruel." "She orchestrated our separation 30 years ago," Helen reminded. "She organized threats. Persecutions forced me to give up my son. I don't think she's bluffing." Michael walked a few steps, processing the situation. When he turned to face them again, there was a determination in his eyes that surprised them. "Then let's end this once and for all," he said. "I've already lost 30 years with my real family. I won't lose even one more day because of the whims of a woman who thinks she has the right to control others' lives." Richard felt pride flooding his chest. "Michael, this could be dangerous. Carla has resources, connections." "And we have the truth," Michael interrupted him. "And we have each other. After spending my entire life wondering who I really was, I finally found my family. I'm not going to give it up without a fight." Helen approached the two most important men in her life, feeling a courage she hadn't experienced for decades. "Then we fight," she said simply. "Together." Richard enveloped Helen and Michael in an embrace that sealed the pact between them. For the first time in 30 years, he felt he had something truly important to protect, and this time he wouldn't allow anything or anyone to destroy his family again. But as they embraced under the lights of the police station, none of the three noticed they were being watched from a distance. Carla had underestimated their determination, but she wasn't willing to accept defeat. If they wanted to fight, she would give them a war they would never forget. Night had fallen over the Florida coast when Richard, Helen, and Michael settled into a discreet inn in the historic center of the small coastal town. The place had been strategically chosen, far from the resort where Carla could easily find them, but close enough for them to act quickly when necessary. The owner, an elderly man who knew Helen from when she worked in the region, offered them a family suite at the back of the establishment, away from curious eyes. Richard had been on the phone for more than an hour, mobilizing resources he had accumulated during decades of business success. Lawyers, private investigators, corporate security specialists, a network of professionals he normally used to protect his business, but which he now directed entirely to protect his newly reunited family. "Martha," he said to his secretary, who was working late to coordinate operations from New York, "I need you to access the company's old files. Everything related to Carla's financial transactions over the last 30 years. Bank accounts, investments, any suspicious movements." "Mr. Blackwell," Martha responded hesitantly, "this could be considered unauthorized investigation of a family member. Carla ceased to be family the moment she threatened my son," Richard replied, with a coldness that made Martha shiver on the other end of the line. "She is now a corporate threat that needs to be neutralized. Use all necessary resources." While Richard organized the investigation, Michael was sitting on the small sofa in the suite, leafing through the documents that Carla had shown about Helen the previous morning. His training in systems analysis had taught him to look for patterns and inconsistencies, and there was something in the reports that didn't match the narrative Carla had constructed. "Mom," he said, using the word that still sounded strange, but wonderful in his mouth, "these reports about your psychiatric commitments, do you remember the details?" Helen approached, sitting beside her son with an intimacy that grew with each hour spent together. "It was a very difficult period in my life. After you were born and I had to let you go, I entered a deep depression. I spent a few months in a private clinic." "Private clinic?" Michael frowned. "But it says here they were public institutions, and the dates don't match. According to these documents, you were committed to 3 different clinics at the same time." Helen took the papers, studying them with growing confusion. "This isn't right. I was never in these institutions, and definitely not at the same time." Michael felt adrenaline running through his veins. "These documents are falsified. Carla fabricated evidence to justify her actions and convinced Dad that you were unstable." Richard, who had finished his call and heard the conversation, quickly approached. "Are you sure?" "Almost certain. Look here." Michael pointed to some inconsistencies in the documents. "The doctor's signatures are too identical, probably made by the same person. The institution stamps have small differences that suggest forgery. And," he paused, turning a page, "one of the hospitals mentioned here didn't even exist at the time indicated." Richard felt a fury growing in his chest. For decades, he had carried the image of Helen as someone mentally fragile based on the evidence Carla had presented. Discovering that everything had been fabricated made him question how many other lies he had believed over the years. "This gives us a weapon against her," Richard said. "Falsification of medical documents is a federal crime, but we need more evidence." It was then that Helen's phone rang. The number was unknown, but she answered anyway, putting it on speaker so the others could hear. "Helen Morris?" The voice was male, elderly, carrying an authority that suggested decades of experience. "Who's speaking?" "My name is Dr. August Mitchell. I was the Blackwell family lawyer for 40 years until I retired 5 years ago. I need to speak with you urgently." Richard immediately recognized the name. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Richard Blackwell. What do you want with us?" "You're in great danger, and I have information that can help you, but I can't speak over the phone. There are too many microphones, too many ears. Can you meet me?" "Helen." Richard and Michael exchanged glances. "Where?" Richard asked. "There's an old church in the historic center of the town where you are, St. Peter's Church. I've known the priest for decades. It's a safe place. 1 o'clock in the morning. Come." Alone. The call ended, leaving them in tense silence. "It could be a trap," Helen said. "Or it could be our salvation," Richard replied. "Dr. Mitchell is a man of integrity. If he has information, we need to hear it." At 1 o'clock in the morning, the 3 walked through the deserted streets of the historic center to St. Peter's Church, a colonial construction dating from the 18th century. The church was open, illuminated only by candles that created dancing shadows on the stone walls. Dr. Mitchell was waiting for them on a front pew, a thin and dignified figure with completely white hair and formal clothes, even at that hour of the early morning. "Richard," he said, standing to greet them, "you've grown a lot since the last time I saw you, and this must be Helen." He extended his hand to her with a courtesy that surprised her. "And you," he looked at Michael, "must be Michael. The resemblance to your father in his youth is impressive." "You know about Michael?" Richard asked, surprised. "I know many things that Carla thought she had buried forever." Dr. Mitchell gestured for them to sit on nearby pews. "I worked for your family for 4 decades, Richard. I drafted wills, contracts, adoption documents, and I also witnessed secrets that have haunted me for years." "What secrets?" Helen asked. Dr. Mitchell breathed deeply before beginning. "In 1993, your sister Carla came to my office with a proposal that horrified me. She wanted me to create false documents to force the separation between you two. When I refused, she found other means." "What other means?" Richard asked, although part of him already knew the answer. "She hired private investigators to follow you, photographers to document your relationship. And when she learned of Helen's pregnancy, she hired people to intimidate her." Dr. Mitchell paused, looking directly at Helen. "The threats you received weren't vague. Carla had people willing to carry them out." Helen felt a chill run down her spine. She really would have hurt the baby? She would have done anything to protect what she considered the family's interests. Dr. Mitchell removed a thick envelope from his coat. "When I retired, I took with me copies of documents that prove everything I'm saying. Contracts with investigators, payment receipts for intimidation, even recordings of conversations where Carla explicitly discusses how to separate you." Richard took the envelope with trembling hands. "Why did you keep this for all these years?" "Because I knew one day it would be necessary. And because," Dr. Mitchell looked directly at him, "because your father made me promise before he died that I would protect you from Carla's destructive ambitions if necessary." "My father knew." "Your father suspected. In the last years of his life, he began to question some of the decisions Carla had influenced. He even mentioned that he would like to find Helen and personally apologize for what had happened." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. His father, whom he had always seen as a cold man focused only on business, had felt remorse for the role he played in the couple's separation. Michael, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Doctor, is this evidence enough to legally incriminate Carla?" "It's more than enough. We have document falsification, intimidation, conspiracy, extortion, crimes that could result in decades in prison." Helen felt a mixture of relief and vengeance running through her veins. Finally, after 30 years, the truth was coming to light. "What do we need to do?" "First, we need to ensure you're safe. Carla won't passively accept exposure." Dr. Mitchell checked his watch. "I've already arranged for discreet police protection around the inn where you're staying. And tomorrow morning we'll deliver all the evidence to the district attorney." "And what about the business?" Richard asked. "Carla has important positions in the company." "That will be resolved through the courts. With the evidence we have, she'll be removed from all positions and lose any rights to family assets." When they left the church an hour later, Richard, Helen, and Michael felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from their shoulders. For the first time in 3 decades, they had not only hope, but also the necessary tools to build a future together. Back at the inn, while Michael slept in the adjacent room, Richard and Helen stayed awake talking about the future. Sitting on the small balcony overlooking the sea, they watched the waves breaking on the beach illuminated by the full moon. "Can you believe it's finally over?" Helen asked, her head resting on Richard's shoulder. "Not yet," Richard admitted, wrapping his arms around her. "For so long I carried the guilt of having abandoned you, knowing it was all Carla's manipulation. It's liberating and devastating at the same time." "I feel that too. For years I blamed myself for not fighting harder to find you, for giving up on us so easily." Helen raised her face to look at him. "But perhaps everything happened as it should. Michael grew up with a loving family. You built an empire that you can now use for good, and I learned to be strong enough to fight for us this time." Richard caressed her face, marveling at how Helen's beauty had deepened with maturity. I love you, Helen. I loved you at 18. I loved you during all these years of separation, and I love you now, more than ever. I love you too, she responded, and when they kissed it was as if 30 years of pain and longing dissolved in a single perfect connection. The kiss evolved into urgent caresses that spoke of decades of repressed desire. There, on the balcony under the moonlight, they made love with a passion that transcended the age difference and the scars of the past. It was a reunion not just of bodies, but of souls that had always belonged to each other. Afterward, lying intertwined on the small balcony sofa, Helen traced lazy circles on Richard's chest. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, we build the life." "That should always have been ours," Richard responded. "Marry me, Helen. Not because it's what we should have done 30 years ago, but because it's what we want to do now." Helen smiled, a smile that illuminated her entire face. "I thought you'd never ask. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes." The next morning, while having breakfast at the inn, Michael observed his parents with a smile that mixed happiness and melancholy. "You know this is going to take work, right?" he said. 30 years of difference to make up for." "We have the rest of our lives for that," Richard responded, squeezing Helen's hand. "And you?" Helen asked her son. "How do you feel about all this? About discovering we're your parents, about the way you were raised?" Michael reflected for a moment before answering. "I feel gratitude. For the parents who raised me and gave me love when you couldn't be present, for you having made the hardest decision of your lives to protect me, and for finally having the chance to be a real family." Richard's phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Dr. Mitchell. "Richard, the evidence was delivered to the district attorney this morning. Carla was arrested an hour ago at her home in New York. The charges include document falsification, extortion, intimidation, and conspiracy. She won't be able to interfere in your lives again." Richard closed his eyes, feeling decades of tension finally dissipate. "Thank you, Doctor, for everything. Now you can live in peace." 6 months later, St. Peter's Chapel by the sea was decorated with white and blue flowers that perfectly harmonized with the view of the sea through the colonial windows. Helen walked down the central aisle in a simple but elegant dress, her hair loose in soft waves that framed a face radiant with happiness. At 48, she had never felt more beautiful or more complete. Richard waited for her at the altar, wearing a light suit appropriate for the coastal climate, but his eyes were fixed only on her. Michael stood beside him as best man, proud, to finally have a real family to celebrate. The ceremony was small and intimate, with only the closest friends and Michael's adoptive parents, who had naturally become part of the extended family with surprising naturalness. The priest who married them was the same one who had offered refuge on the night they met Dr. Mitchell, completing a circle of protection and blessings. When Richard and Helen exchanged rings, both were openly crying. They were tears of joy, of relief, of 30 years of love that could finally be freely expressed. "For all the years we lost and for all the years we'll still have," Richard said during his personal vows. "For our family that survived everything, and only became stronger," Helen responded. The kiss that sealed the union was applauded not only by the guests, but also by the resort guests nearby who had stopped to watch the ceremony on the beach. It was a happy ending that the entire local community had begun to root for, after learning about the love story that had resisted 3 decades of separation. At the wedding reception, held at a seaside restaurant, Michael gave a speech that left everyone in tears. "Throughout my life I wondered where my determination came from, my ability to love deeply, my refusal to give up on dreams." He looked at Richard and Helen, seated at the main table holding hands. "Now I know it comes from you, from a father who built an empire with integrity and passion, from a mother who sacrificed everything for love and never lost hope. You gave me the greatest possible gift, not just life, but the example of how to live it with purpose." A year later, the Blackwell Morris family had settled into a routine that perfectly blended work, love, and mutual discovery. Richard had transferred the company's main operations to the coast, building a modern headquarters that respected the local architecture and offered quality jobs for the community. Helen had left her job at the resort to dedicate herself to a foundation she had created to help single mothers and children in vulnerable situations. The work gave her purpose and allowed her to transform her personal experience into strength to help others. Michael had become General Director of Innovation for the company, implementing technologies that not only increased business efficiency, but also improved employee working conditions. He lived in a beach house close enough for regular family dinners, but independent enough to maintain his autonomy as a young adult. On Sunday nights, the three gathered at the main house, an elegant but welcoming construction that Richard had built on a hill overlooking the sea. They cooked together, told stories, planned trips, and simply enjoyed each other's company in ways they had been deprived of for decades. On one of these nights, while watching the sunset from the veranda, Helen found Richard leafing through a photo album they had been organizing. Images of the wedding, family vacations, everyday moments that documented the life they could finally live together. "Any regrets?" she asked, sitting beside him. Richard looked at her with an intensity that still made her tremble after all these months of marriage. "None, not even about the lost years." "Why not?" "Because they brought us here. They made us the people we are today. People capable of valuing what we have because we know what it's like to lose it." Helen smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And Michael, do you think he forgives our absence?" "Look at him." Richard pointed to where Michael was on the beach, playing paddleball with some local friends he had made. "He's happy, secure, full of love to give. We did that, Helen. Even separated, even without knowing, we created an extraordinary son." That night, when Michael came up to the house for dinner, he found his parents embracing on the veranda, watching the stars that were beginning to appear in the dark sky. "You know you're disgustingly in love, right?" he joked, but there was affection in his voice. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for," Helen responded, pulling her son to join the embrace. "And we have a lot of future to build," Richard added. As the three remained embraced under the starry sky, listening to the eternal sound of waves breaking on the beach, it was impossible not to feel that they were finally where they should always have been. It wasn't just a happy ending, it was a new beginning. A second chance that life had granted them after decades of waiting and suffering. Carla had been sentenced to 15 years in prison and had lost all rights to family assets. The evidence presented by Dr. Mitchell had not only incriminated her but also revealed a network of corruption and manipulation that extended for decades. But for Richard, Helen, and Michael, Carla had become irrelevant, a shadow of the past that had no power over the bright future they were building together. And as the ocean continued its eternal rhythm beyond the veranda, the family that had been separated by ambition and cruelty finally found the peace they had always deserved. Love had won. Truth had triumphed. And after 30 years of separation, they had the rest of their lives to make up for every lost moment. Sometimes, happy endings are worth the wait. Sometimes, love really is stronger than any force that tries to destroy it. And sometimes, sometimes families separated by fate manage to reunite and discover that the lost time only made their love deeper and more precious. In the house on the hill overlooking the sea, Richard, Helen, and Michael had finally found their forever.